Thank you so very much for joining us on another session of ACE Learns. My name is Elise, and I am ACE's, oh my gosh, I had a blank on my job title because it's changed slightly. Partnership Development Outreach Manager, excuse me. Thank you very much for joining us on our session for July. I am so grateful to be joined by the one and only Kylie Newland, who is a current ACE member serving within our EPIC division. Without further ado, Kylie Newland, please take it away.
Right. Thank you, Elise. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I'm so excited to be here and present my ACE Learns topic on repatriation and cultural preservation. It's going to be a deep dive into the behind the scenes work of California State Parks cultural resources that I get to be a part of as an intern at the statewide museum collection center. So, as Elise put it, without further ado, maybe a little bit more ado, actually. First, a little bit about me. My entire life has been full of movement and culture shock. I've lived in three different countries between the US, Russia, and China. And these periods of cultural immersion have greatly influenced the path that I've chosen in historical preservation. I'm originally from Folsom, California, where our major claim to fame is our prison or the song that Johnny Cash wrote about our prison. So we have that going for us. Um, when I was 5 years old, my mom accepted a position overseas in Moscow, Russia. The middle photo at the top of my family posing in front of the car with the apartment buildings in the background is from Moscow. That car was the rental that we had during the 2 years I was there. It was super fancy. It even had the nice little window cranks that you had to manually crank down the windows and everything. You can also tell it's Russia because the big, beautiful fur hat that my dad is sporting there. And I'm the little kid in the green and gray hoodie in the front, and next to me is my brother Lance. Shout out to Lance. Um, After Russia, we moved back home for a couple of years. And then when I was 10 years old, we moved again, this time to Beijing, China. Not everyone gets to say that by the time they were 15, they'd spent less than a third of their life actually living in their home country. The exposure to other cultures that I was privileged enough to experience while living abroad has stuck with me ever since and has inspired my deep interest in cultural anthropology. Learning about systems of society and how culture changes over time has helped bring me closer to the world as a global citizen and a lover of all things history. After China, I moved back to the States to Portland, Oregon for 2 years of high school. The one and only photo I will show of that is not in Oregon, it's back in China during a trip I took. The rest of the photos of me from high school you don't get to see, they're very embarrassing. My senior year of high school, I moved again to Santa Barbara, California, where I got my associate's degree in history from Santa Barbara City College. And just recently, my BA in cultural anthropology from UC Santa Barbara, where I graduated from in June of last year. During my undergrad at UCSB, I volunteered actually to help my local museums inventory process that they are doing for repatriation efforts under NAGPRA. This was an intensive, exhaustive process that takes years, which I was definitely not there for the entirety of the project. But the couple of months I spent working in collections has inspired me ever since to go on this crazy path towards museum work. The sensation of holding history in your own hands is it's like nothing else. After I graduated, I was hired to my first ever ACE term as an interpretation intern for Tule Lake National Monument. Tule Lake was the largest and most controversial of the Japanese internment camps opened to house forcibly removed Japanese Americans during World War II. At Tule Lake, I guided visitors through the on-site historic concrete jail and had the chance to write interpretive text for an interactive exhibit based on research that I conducted during my time there, which was on how internees at Tule Lake made impossible choices on what to bring with them or leave behind, considering the time that they had from when they got the evacuation orders to the time that they were actually forcibly removed, which in some cases was only 2 days. Also considering prejudice, the racism of the time, space constraints too. My research mainly asked If you could only bring with you what you can physically carry, how can you choose between the bare necessities for survival or irreplaceable family heirlooms? Which is an impossible question for anyone. Tule Lake also gave me my first opportunities to interact with descendant community members directly related to the site's history. The majority demographic of people on my tours were either survivors of the camp system or their families. I learned firsthand the significance of respectful interactions with peoples, objects, stories, and cultural histories, a lot of which I've brought with me to my current ACE role with state parks today. History tends to be thought of, I mean, it's in the name, history, as only the past, but Tule Lake was living proof that these stories are alive and affecting people today and are living on in these communities. So the two most recent photos on here of me are the big one to the left and the bottom middle one. Uh, these were both taken during a curatorial training workshop in Lake Tahoe at Sugar Pine Point State Park, where I had the opportunity to help open, inventory, and stage a historic house museum for its summer season. This was such an amazing experience, and I was lucky enough to be featured on June's ACE newsletter for an article that I wrote. If you haven't had the chance to check it out yet, as the author, I am legally required to tell you to read it and then connect to me and tell me how amazing I am and how much you love my work and how talented I am and all that fun stuff. The last photo in the corner is of my biological son, Arugula. He is my pride and joy, and I hope someday he follows in his mother's footsteps and starts his own career in historical preservation. My passion for historical preservation has led me through two ACE terms, this one included, and recently got me a spot in the University of Toronto's Master of Museum Studies program, where I move to at the end of next month, which is, when I was originally writing all of this down, it was 3, 4 months away, and now it's in a little under 3 weeks, and that terrifies me, but also excites me to no end. So I am so excited to continue my research there into how we as humans have interacted with objects through time and how we do so today. So moving on, enough about me. The Statewide Museum Collection Center, or SMCC as we call it, is in McClellan Park, Sacramento. McClellan Park is an industrial warehouse sort of area that actually used to be an Air Force base. Since the concrete interior of our warehouse was originally built to withstand the weight of jets and their equipment, the weight of everything that we currently have in our storage and collections is easily accommodated by the infrastructure. SMCC is home to over 1 million artifacts and objects. Our photography archive alone numbers over 400,000 in glass plate negatives, lantern slides, and something called daguerreotypes, which I actually had to look up for this presentation. They are apparently the earliest publicly available form of photography, dating to the early 1830s, which is pretty cool, just as a side note. Besides the photos archive, we have objects ranging from California Indian baskets, covered wagons, actual historical covered wagons, which was so cool to see in person, early railroad equipment, works of art, so much more. The amazing people who work hard to take care of these items are archivists, curators, interpretive specialists, archaeologists, tribal liaisons, museum technicians, research data analysts, database administrators, and little old me. My role is technically known as a digital data and multimedia collections intern, but most of what I do is pretty much data analytics, but more on that later. Unfortunately, due to the nature of most of the items in our collections, the contents of SMCC are largely restricted to the public. The items that I work with are entirely affiliated with Native peoples, so showing the items themselves is prohibited and incredibly confidential. Big bummer, since I wish I could share with you just some of the stories associated with the objects I've seen. But instead, I'll be using examples of my own that have absolutely no chance of being culturally affiliated to Indigenous peoples. There is some hope, SMCC has a public-facing exhibit showcasing the diversity of histories and peoples that State Parks has documented during its 130 years in operation. This exhibit is in the reception of the building and is available by appointment for tours of the exhibit and also a behind-the-scenes tour of the warehouse itself. The other chance you may have of catching an insider's view of our collection leads me to my next slide, which is the Sacramento Archives Crawl. So you can view some of State Parks items in person when they're brought downtown each year in October in celebration of National Archives Month. Archives and special collections and libraries from throughout the region open their doors to the public and showcase their rarely seen holdings during the Sacramento Archives Crawl. My coworker, Rebecca Crowther, who's an archivist in the DDMCP program at SMCC, helps bring this crawl to life and has done so, I believe, for over a decade. And she would definitely love to see you there. So I'd be remiss if I didn't plug that program as well. Moving on, repatriation, bread and butter. What is it? The definition of repatriation is the process by which persons, material heritage, and or associated knowledge are returned to their places of origin. So for us, that means that any institution that receives funding on a state and or federal level is required by law to begin the process of identification and repatriation of any Native American items in their collections. This is known as NAGPRA, which stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is a mouthful. This was first enacted in 1990, and the California addendum creating CalNAGPRA was added in 2001 to address gaps on a state level, essentially. So the Digital Data and Multimedia Collections Program is a subdivision within Cultural Resources that helps maintain digital record keeping of state parks' vast collections and their archives, of course. So as an intern with ACE and with the California State Parks Cultural Resources, my coworkers and I are pretty much on the front end of repatriation efforts. The work we do helps make sure that the history of California indigenous peoples, and their artifacts are meticulously researched, cataloged, and maintained so these items can be traced back to their original tribes from which they were taken. All right, what artifacts in an institution's collection are actually affected by NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA? First and foremost, most obviously, ancestral remains, whether they be Native American in general or specifically Californian Indian. Also, artifacts or objects associated with California Indian or Native American grave sites or burial grounds, as well as any and all culturally significant objects reasonably believed to be associated with tribes. I do want to pause for a moment here and explain the term California Indian tribe. The legal definition of California Indian tribe is as follows. So it's number one, located in the state of California. Two, meets the definition of an Indian tribe under federal legislation, which is set by NAGPRA, and or is a Native American tribe located in California that is on the consultation contact list maintained by the Native American Heritage Commission in California. 109 out of 575 federally recognized tribes reside in the state of California. Californian tribes make up almost a fifth of all United States federally recognized Native American tribes. On top of those 109 recognized tribes, there are over 50 more that are not federally recognized just in this state alone. According to the LA Times, 81 California tribes have sought acknowledgement since 1978. So this holistic definition of a California Indian tribe ensures that all tribes in the state of California, regardless of whether they're federally recognized, are included in the repatriation process. Continuing on, another aspect of the language used in the legal repatriation process that I want to discuss is the use of the term Indian. When Christopher Columbus arrived in America, he mistakenly believed that he had made it all the way to the East Indies, which is Southeast Asia, and therefore referred to the native peoples that he found and encountered here as Indios or Indians in English. Since then, the term American Indian has been used as a blanket term for Indigenous Americans in colonial administration up until today, including in institutions such as the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs and in NAGPRA/CalNAGPRA legislation. Its use in the legal process of repatriation is the main reason why I use it in this presentation, but it is worth saying that its use does remain controversial and highly dependent on individuals and tribes themselves. Some prefer the term, some don't. As an alternative, Native American rose in prominence in the 1970s from activist and scholar input, and is used with greater or similar frequency, particularly among younger generations. The term that I personally prefer to use is indigenous, which names a cultural and political movement towards a critical global perspective on native sovereignty over self-determination, lands, knowledge systems, language, and culture, of course, for all persons native to their respective regions around the world. Indigenous is often used by Native American individuals, groups, and tribal governments to advocate for authority over their own destinies. That being said, today I am going to primarily use the terms Native American and American Indian since they are used most prominently in the legislation itself. So just heads up. um, the actual process of repatriation. Now that you have some sense of how repatriation is defined and what it's used for in California, we're going to walk through the actual steps of the repatriation process as outlined in NAGPRA legislation. Before we jump into that, it is worth noting that Cal NAGPRA was updated into 2021 by Governor Newsom to add additional requirements. It includes a regularly maintained and updated list of California Indian tribes and their territories to be created by the Native American Heritage Commission, adopting new mediation procedures for repatriation items during consultation stages, and publishing completion notices of preliminary inventories and summaries on the Commission website. That's a lot of words. Essentially, these changes are meant to create better working relationships between the state and California tribes through intentional accessibility and equitable understandings. By making sure that tribal contact lists are routinely updated and collections, inventories, and summaries are publicly available, the process of repatriation becomes more transparent for everyone involved. Considering that the main onus of repatriation is still on the tribes themselves to decide whether they want to lay claim to certain items, making sure that all reasonably relevant information about said items is already available ensures that tribes have as much agency over these decisions as early in the process as possible. So the first step is identification through inventorying. So with those earlier changes in mind, let's talk about the fact that every agency or museum in the state of California that possesses native human remains and funerary objects is required to, according to the legislation itself, and I'm quoting it direct here, complete an inventory or update a preliminary inventory of all these remains and associated funerary objects, and to the extent possible, based on all information possessed by the agency or museum, do all of the following. Identify geographical location, cultural affiliation, Aboriginal territory, and circumstances surrounding acquisition, and consult prior to new or additional inventory work being conducted with affiliated California Indian tribes on any protocols to be used in the inventory process, such as minimizing handling or prioritizing tribal knowledge on ceremonial or ancestral remains and their identification. This is, again, meant to make these items, as clearly culturally affiliated as possible. On the other hand, human remains and funerary objects that aren't clearly identifiable but can still be reasonably determined to be affiliated with California Indian tribes aren't, removed from the list or anything drastic like that. Since this reasonable affiliation determination is based not only on the unique information from their acquisitional circumstances, but also on California history itself. Any reasonable suspicion of unclear tribal affiliation is still considered to have enough evidence to include it on inventory lists, just without any specific tribal identification. This is, again, where tribal consultation comes into play, not only after the inventory is released, but during this initial identification process as well. Guided by the expertise of that California Native American Heritage Commission, tribes that may be culturally affiliated with said items are consulted during the completion of the inventory. This includes, but is not limited to, tribes whose state aboriginal territory includes the object from where the item was removed from. So removing as much margin of error during the identification stage is crucial. And we'll keep that in mind later in the presentation as well. Now, on the off chance that the museum or agency inventories their collection and finds that they don't have any ancestral remains or cultural items, all they have to do next is say as such in a summary letter to the commission, and their work ends there. For everyone else, which is the majority, once the initial inventory has been finished, a written summary of the museum's collections is shared with the commission, and the consultation stage officially begins. The consultation stage process is particularly important, and protocol here differs depending on whether the inventory tribes can be reasonably and clearly attributed to a specific tribe. If the connection is clear, those items are actually listed first to expedite their particular repatriation process. And actually, the legislation notes here that this clear label should be defined entirely by tribal knowledge, which is, again, only possible through tribal consultation. Therefore, tribal knowledge and involvement becomes paramount to the entire operation. Considering that these items were removed during a time of intense violence towards the Californian Indian way of life and Californian Indian peoples, centering Indigenous knowledge during repatriation is one small step towards righting those wrongs. Through consultation, tribes and their knowledge are inherently prioritized. If they want a funerary item or ancestor handled in a certain way, or for curators to minimize handling as much as possible, their word is literally law. Tribes can agree or disagree with the inventory's findings, and based on such, the institution either goes back to the drawing board to revise their findings, or are able to change the status of their inventory from preliminary to final, and then continue past the review period and into the next step of repatriation, which is placing a claim. So either a tribe themselves or a linear descendant claiming a relationship with the human remains or cultural item can do so, providing that, and the nitty gritty here, the claim is A, filed with both the commission and the institution holding the items, and B, that person can provide reasonable evidence that the ancestor or item can be traced to their descendant, cultural, or tribal group using traditional kinship tracing methods of the tribe, or just general descendancy rules, and or that it was originally removed from their territory. So 3 things there to keep track of. Once the request for repatriation has been made, the commission forwards the request onto the institution, and the request is then required to be honored within 90 days if all other qualifications outlined during the process have been met. If there are multiple claims to the same item, or if the institution objects in good faith to there being a cultural affiliation to the requesting tribe, a mediation period can occur, but ultimately repatriation ends here as either completed or sent back for further consultation and review. So I spoke earlier about the importance of removing margins of error from the information gathered by institutions during the inventorying stage. The reason I want to return to that now is because that's pretty much entirely what my internship is based around. California State Parks is required to maintain accurate inventories to stay aligned with CalNAGPRA standards. But as a 130-year-old institution that has collections in over 100 parks across the state, and each park's curation team has used different systems over the decades. And, with
Yep.
130 years, there's been several generations of curations and their teams and everything. No one's standardized literally anything. Inventorying becomes an incredibly difficult and exhaustive process, and that's where I come in. So State Parks uses a digital database to store information on their archives and collections called the Museum System, or TMS, as it's more widely known by. TMS is used by many institutions with large enough collections that smaller databases or even just physical record keeping just won't cut it. We switched to TMS from an older record keeping system in the early 2000s. And unfortunately, that switch has complicated it even further because it repopulated data from certain text fields into completely different ones. This especially proves frustrating when repatriation requests come in, as we can't be sure the information we have is accurate in the first place or even in the right place that it's meant to be in. So, as an intern, I go through up to over 100 files in a day. I'm checking for informational accuracy about location, cultural ties, acquisitional circumstances, donor information, and even spelling and grammar issues. I processed almost 2,000 files over the course of my internship, but considering that State Parks holds over 1 million files in TMS in total, we have much farther to go. TMS has an incredibly complicated layout. During my interview, actually, I asked what goal they'd expect me to reach during my first month on the job. And they looked at each other and told me, honestly, just be able to understand the basics of TMS. I expected, some lofty goal of processing 100 files. No, I probably got through a quarter of that in my first month. Today, I have the extreme pleasure of forcing all of you to go through TMS training, just like I did. This will be so much fun. So, without further ado, this is our example object file. For this demonstration, I'm using a fake file that I made with a stuffed plushie from home. I call him Big Freak for obvious reasons. Yes, those are teeth, though no, they are not human teeth. They are plastic, thank God, but it is freaky. So for obvious reasons, my partner got him for me for my birthday, and I thought he'd be a perfect addition to State Parks collection. So shout out to Colin. Thank you so much. Um, the main sections in TMS to keep track of are going to be the top half of the screen where the classification, period, date, object name, constituents, stuff like that are located. And the bottom half, which are split into several tabs. So we have front card, notes, documentation, media, context, related, other bibliography, flex fields. That is a lot. It seems like a lot at first, but only a select few of those are actually needed to document the kinds of objects that I process. You'd use bibliography for research. You'd use media if you are like taking photos of a piece of art or something like that. But today and here, we only use those tabs to take a photo of Big Freak. um, the first text fields we're going to talk about are the basics here. So at the top is the object number. Right over here, that's the 082-6000-8. And as you can see, it's split into three parts. The first three digits correspond to the state park that originally officially entered the object into State Parks records. So SMCC is 082. So any object number starting with 082 was originally first processed here. The second part is the accession number. And an accession is essentially a package of associated objects that were processed together at the same time for a variety of reasons, maybe because they came to the park at the same time, or from the same source, or made by the same person, or affiliated to the same culture, time frame, et cetera, et cetera. It just means that we received those items as part of one accessional package. So the third part of the object number, that 8 there, tells us the chronological listing of the object in the accession. If the last number is 1, for example, it's the first in the accession. If the number is 302, it's the 302nd item in the accession. For us, since the last number is 8, it's the 8th item. Um, Now we're going to look at the date. So we actually have two dates that we want to keep track of: when the item was made and when it was officially accessioned to state parks. The date field here corresponds to both, and clicking on it gives further information. However, since we don't actually know when exactly Big Freak over here was made, and since it was never actually accessioned or given to state parks, that section is going to be blank for the purposes of this example. After that is the period. And this is important. This is actually time period in particular. Older records that we have in our system will use outdated language like prehistoric to refer to Native American artifacts, but this assumes that history only started in America when colonialization began. I update these records to say pre-contact instead, and if the field is already blank, I don't change anything. It being blank says something of itself, and since I don't, as a database administrator, I can't see those items in person. It's a little file on my screen. I don't really have the authority to say when exactly it was made or to make those kinds of assumptions myself. Um, After that, we're going to talk about classification and constituents. So as you can see, Big Freak is classified as ethnographic material up at the top, which essentially means any object that provides tangible insight about a cultural community's history, identity, cultural practices, stuff like that. Our stuffed toy is made by humans and tells us about recreational toy styles during the 2020s. Under the umbrella of ethnographic materials, we then classify it as a recreational item. But if it wasn't a stuffed toy, there's many others to choose from: tools and equipment, ceremonial or religious items, personal objects such as clothing or jewelry, weaponry, currency and coins, for example. There's many others. My ACE project scope only relates to ethnographic material, namely any objects associated to Native American cultures. Um, Below that, under period, we have the constituents field, which is for the specific people or groups that molded this particular item. And this is where we put the names of the artist, the collector, the person that found the item, the company that made it, the company that sold it, anything we know about the people who came in contact with it before state parks. There is a wide database of names actually that state parks uses, so it's not like a free text entry field, which is good for attributing multiple items to a certain artist or collector, but bad for me in my example, since this isn't a real state parks item and the company that made this isn't one that state parks keeps track of in their collections. Um, so both classifications and constituents fields are important. They function like sub searches, essentially. If a person were to look for all items made by a certain artist or housed in a certain collection, they could. If they wanted to look at every item labeled as currency, they could. If they wanted to see, I already said the certain artist stuff, but essentially without these fields, we lose important tracking information that could otherwise give insight on the items themselves. Um, Next, materials. Pretty self-explanatory, just a list of all the materials used to make the item. We have fabric, dye, plastic, and glass, to name a few. And this is, however, important to use solely based off of prior documentation. If you, for example, describe a basket within a collection as being made with plastic based off of what you can see in the photo of it, ignoring the fact that in prior documentation it's listed as a basket made of willow, then some poor curator somewhere in the future is going to be searching in vain for a plastic basket in their collection that doesn't exist. So after materials, description. Again, pretty self-explanatory. The description of the object should be based off of information cataloged by the people who have actually assessed the item in person for the same reason as the material slide. Since in this case, I'm the person assessing the item, I wrote the description myself, um, which is all well and good. But again, if I didn't have this item in front of me, I would not want to assume anything about how it was used, what it looks like, what the materials were looked like, what the design is, et cetera, et cetera. Um, After that is subject. While normally this field is used for recording information about a work of art, for Native American collections, we use it to assist with searching. For all Indigenous records, we update it to include the cultural group affiliation, locational info about where it was made or found, especially the state that it was found in or the county if it is in California, whether it's associated with a burial, and the name of said burial, if we have it, as well as the name of the maker and or the source that state parks got it from. Most records will have some of this information, but not all. I just record what I can. The information is dispersed throughout the record in multiple fields, and further research is often required to narrow down where a reference location actually is. If, for example, the record says an item was found by X road outside of B town, I need to research exactly where that town is and find the county and state that it resides in. All information is then recorded in a keyword style format, separating each by a comma. So, for example, I've included my name, my partner's name, the name of the company that made it, and the state that it was bought or acquired in. However, since we aren't sure where exactly the plushie was manufactured, I didn't enter any further locational details, such as the county, for example. After that, we have the dimensions, which is the physical attributes of the item according to length, width, height, circumference, other associated numerical dimensions. If we have multiple items in a collection that are nearly identical, keeping track of the physical dimensions helps further differentiate between them. Lucky for Big Freak, since there's nothing like it in State Park's collection. After that is the object name, which is not to be confused with the title next to it. Though similar, the title field is solely reserved for works of art or published books or things like that that have labeled titles. This instead is a basic 1 to 2 word description of the item, such as shirt, bowl, basket, or in my case, stuffed toy. Next, we have notes. So all the previous fields were found on the front card tab. This second tab, notes, documents previous file histories updated by other curators and collection managers. The curatorial remarks field in the top right documents any comments made by the curators about the history of the item and how it entered our collections. In this case, I've updated to describe a brief history of the item before it got to state parks, explaining how Kylie Newland, me, received it as a gift before donating it to state parks in June for the use of this webinar. You'll notice that this seems similar to how the description field on the last tab was used, but the description tells us about the appearance of the item, while this remarks tab tells us about any related context, not the appearance itself. Although something to note here is that during the conversion to this database from State Park's previous one, many items descriptions were automatically populated into the curatorial remarks field. So a large part of the standardization process is then removing the information found here and putting it back under description where it belongs. Under the remarks field is the text entry field. If there have been any other comments throughout the years, maybe describing accompanying research or possible cultural ties that have been uncovered, they'd go here. Then we're able to see not only the information itself, but also whoever left the comment and when the text entry was added. We can then create a timeline of all that's been found out about the item, further helping strengthen attached information. So next is the context. The only thing I changed on the context tab is the geography XREF field or the cross-referencing field. This is where we have all of our detail about location entries. The park field unit or the park unit says which park unit originally processed the item into state parks collections again. Not to be confused with the current location information on the first front card tab at the bottom. Since each object record needs to be associated to the park unit that initially acquired the item, this is decided by then the first part of the object number at the top. So you can see how it continues coming up as like a cheat code for everything that we know about the item. For us, this is 082, which is again the code for the SMCC park unit. But if an artifact was found in a certain county or state or even a different country, then we'd add additional cross-reference entry for that as well here. I'm gonna pause for a minute and drink some water. It's really getting to me. Last to be talked about is the related tab. So to me, this essentially ties our object record to the vast web of collections that state parks has. For a real object, the related persons would show under the constituents tag category here, and then the accession number would show under the objects tab. At parks, each object record is associated to the first accession record it arrived with, which all begin with ACCN, so standing for accession. For this example, the fake accession record would look something like ACCN.082-6000, since our object record's first two parts are 082-6000. An object record should only be linked to one accession record, but multiple object records are usually linked to a single accession, which sounds complicated, but you can't have one record in multiple packages, but you can have multiple records in one package, essentially. Last thing to mention on this slide is the site category. So if the record has location information of where the item was found or made, the information should be recorded in the sites module here. In an effort to make searching for said item easier, we use the archaeological trinomial system, even for objects that aren't from archaeological dig sites. Similar to the object number, the trinomial has three parts. The first is the state code, second is the county code, and the third is the code for the specific site that the item came from. So, for example, if this stuffed plushie was made in Sacramento, California, I'd enter CA- for California, SAC- for Sacramento, and then 000, which since it didn't come from any particular dig site, entering 3 zeros links it to the general Sacramento area instead of any specific site. And there you have it. We have successfully standardized an objects record in TMS together. Now do that for 8 hours straight, 5 days a week, and you'll be well on your way to interning in cultural resources at state parks right alongside me. Yay! The last thing I want to mention is something that I was actually wondering myself when I started putting this presentation together. ACE, as we all know, stands for American Conservation Experience. But as an ACE intern in cultural resources, how does what I do possibly relate to conserving natural resources, which is the traditional intent of ACE's work? What does it mean to work in an area focused on preserving instead of conserving? I started looking further into this, which just means that I Googled it. According to the internet, the difference is how hands-on or off the approach is. Natural resource conservation is hands-on and requires active human management and participation in sustainable use of environmental resources, which often includes scientific planning and research and regulating use so that human benefit and the natural longevity of that source it can be prioritized side by side. On the other hand, historical preservation takes a hands-off approach to cultural or historical or even natural resources. Preservation prioritizes the protection of resources in their natural state, free from human interference or alteration. The National Park Service's website sums this up as such. Conservation is the proper use of nature while preservation seeks protection of nature from use. Yet they both have their own schools of scientific planning and research and strict legal and regulatory practices. In cultural resources, we do research and scientific planning as well. We do hands-on treatment of artifacts to ensure that they stay free from the damage of time for as long as possible. We use historical and cultural practices to restore heritage buildings and objects so that they can be learned from and enjoyed for generations to come. If that's not proper use and proper protection combined, I'm not sure what is. And also, not to mention, humans are animals. We are still a part of nature, no matter how many sky rises we build or how much better we think we are because we don't run around naked on all fours. For thousands of years, we have impacted nature just as nature has impacted us. And as a part of nature, we are intrinsically included in both its conservation and preservation. There's only so far that hands off actually takes us. I think that conservation and preservation are more similar than you can imagine, and I have evidence for this. The California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, was enacted in the 1970s and requires state and local governments to inform decision makers and the public about the environmental impacts of proposed new developments, and to then reduce or eliminate those impacts to every feasible extent. This seems like cut and dry conservation with a capital C, right? Except cultural resource protection falls under CEQA regulations as well. New projects, per CEQA guidelines, prepare an environmental impact report, which is required to contain any significant impact to historic or cultural resources. Cultural resource site monitors are present at any builds to ensure that if artifacts or remains are found, they aren't disturbed and or alternatively, they are safely removed and processed to ensure as little impact to them as possible. CEQA stands testament to the fact that conservation and preservation are more deeply entwined than you'd think. And although my job title leans more on the preservation side, I'm proud to do my part in conservation with American conservation experience. You. Thank you for attending my presentation today, and I hope that you've come away from this with a new understanding of how cultural resource preservation and Native American cultural protections function in California state park collections. Thank you.
Thank you, Kylie. Round of applause. I can't tell you how many notes I took. Like that was extremely informative, and now I want to go get another degree in historical preservation and do what you do. New career path. Sorry, not sorry, everybody. With that, though, I'd love to open up. We got about 10 minutes left in our session. If anybody has any questions for Kylie that kind of came up through this presentation or anything they'd like to share, either unmute yourself and express it to the world, or if you'd like to also put it in the chat, that is quite all right. I mean, I've got questions, but I can wait. Studies show it takes 7 seconds or something like that for someone to raise their hand. Please.
I do, yeah, so I do have a question. Kylie, you talked about, the fact that the work you do, obviously you can't speak to specifically what you've worked on or been able to see, but I know when it comes to repatriation, there are a lot of emotions that can come up with that just because the items that you're dealing with are so sensitive. So could you kind of, talk about that and just how that
Great.
also helps to drive you in what you do with your position?
Well, as you can tell, it's a lot of data processing first and foremost, which gets really monotonous if you don't have your own connection to what you're doing. And so really the entire point of sitting here, being in TMS and making sure that these records are as accurate as possible is important for the sole fact that not only are these records then shared with tribes and hopefully gets these items back to where they originally came from, but you also, through the process of standardizing these, you come across, I mean, histories of items that have been defined entirely by their removal from their original territories. You come across items associated with burials. You come across items that people were even buried in, and it's devastating, but it's also so important. I don't know if this work would mean the same to me if I wasn't also as connected to these items. And I've teared up at my desk before. I've talked to supervisors who have teared up while they go through these collections. It's kind of a given that, even if what you're doing seems mundane in your everyday, every once in a while you have these stark reminders of how important and essential the work actually is. And knowing that about these, large data sets and entries and millions of items in these collections, and every single one of them has a story. I'm so incredibly privileged and honored to be able to help, I guess, steward those stories forward into their next sense of it. And I also think that I got really good at dealing with the emotional impacts of this work through my last ACE term too. It's much different to be sitting at a computer and to just, read these things yourself and to then have an emotional reaction. It's another thing entirely when you're talking to people who have been through the things that you were, talking about on your tours, and they're sitting there and telling you about how when they were 5 years old, they remembered looking up at the guard towers, and the barbed wire fences and stuff like that. And I think if I didn't come from that internship first, I don't think I'd have the same appreciation for the fact that these aren't objects that are just static in history. They affect people to this day. And even though there aren't, people talking to me and telling me these stories and I have to read them instead, it doesn't mean that they're not any less connected to people. And unfortunately, they are disconnected. I mean, state parks wouldn't have them if there wasn't, disconnection inherent to those relationships. So it means even more to me to be able to help reconnect them, I guess, in a sense.
I've got a question. So there is the federal NAG NAGBRA. I'm saying that wrong. So it's federally, and then there's Cal State. I'm assuming that there are other states that have adopted kind of their own state-run system in conjunction with the federal system, or is Cal kind of one of the anomalies within that they have a state-run
I'm
system?
not
Or do you
actually
know?
positive on that. It's so
Okay,
funny. I've been in
that's all.
California for so long, and I've heard so much discourse over Cal NAGPRA for so many years that I've never actually stepped away and
Mm-hmm.
been like, oh, maybe other states are having these same conversations as well. No, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, either way, the
Yeah,
the
just
federal NAGPRA rules still apply overall, right? But I would be
okay.
curious to know whether, I mean, California is, like I said at the beginning, we have such an
A
incredible
fifth. Yeah.
variety of cultural areas and peoples in this state. I hesitate to think that we're an outlier there. I would
Right.
more believe that it's possibly just a function of the, Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs that we only have 575 recognized tribes. But I can imagine that other
Mhm.
states are in a similar position where the majority of these cultural descendant communities just have a lot farther of a way to go through this process. So I'm sure
Right.
I'm not in those
Yeah, totally.
conversations the way I am in the California ones, but I'm excited to know what
Of
that looks
course.
like. And that also is something that I'm hoping to be able to learn more about in Canada too. Um,
Yeah.
uh, Canada does not even have any federal repatriation laws or legislation. So it's kind of more up to the
Oh,
institutions there
wow.
to decide how repatriation is going to work, or even if they want to repatriate in the first place, which is surprising to me. I've thought for a while that they're very on top of kind of indigenous sovereignty and helping put more power in the hands of people that haven't had it for, centuries. So it's interesting to me that that looks so different, and it almost seems like there's a vacuum there for stuff like that.
Hmm.
So it's not only a US thing, it's not only a California thing.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. I'm excited. Like Canada doesn't know what's about to come through their borders and into their school. I'm so excited for what you're going to be able to bring within your next chapter and just the knowledge that you've gained thus far. And just not even just from our ACE experiences, but how you've been able to tie that in with your own personal journey and experience, I think is extremely powerful. And I feel like that's even an understatement. But thank you very much for coming up on the last few minutes. I want to open it up. Anyone else have any last burning desire questions you'd love to ask before we say goodbye?
I don't know if this is like entirely appropriate or not because I'm new to the game of Ace. So please forgive me, but I would love to hear kind of what's next. Where I mean, I know you just like gave this robust, impressive presentation, so thank you. But do you have any, yeah, next steps or things you're looking forward to with this work?
First of all, I'm so glad that it comes across as robust. I put like a month of work into this, probably 2.5 months, if I'm being
It
completely honest.
shows.
So
It shows.
I'm really glad. Um, I think I've touched on it a little bit. I'm really hoping that I can learn a little bit more from our northern neighbors on how they approach their treatments and
Yeah.
relationships with their tribal nations. I do want to continue. I touched on it at the beginning, but when I was at Tui Lake, I did a small independent research project about, people forced into displacement and into movement and how they prioritize what objects are the most important in that moment, whether that's items that they literally need to stay alive, or for hygiene or stuff like that, or if it's items that have important cultural emphasis or are family heirlooms and stuff like that. I'm really excited to learn more about that and to kind of follow that research. I think that human history is constantly characterized by movement of so many different kinds. And I know that objects in my own life have taken on their own meanings after I've left one of the places that I've lived. I'm such a hoarder. I have things. I have my old Girl Scout uniform from like when I was a daisy and I was like 8 years old. But I have, even broken pieces of dolls that I still have from when I was in China, or I have a beautiful Russian nesting doll from when I was 5 years old in Moscow. And those items mean so, so much to me. It's impossible to
Yeah.
downsize and start to pack for Canada when my room is covered in those right now. So if they mean this much to me, I can't imagine what people's heirlooms and family objects mean for them and how they, choose to make those decisions throughout history and today. I think there's so much to be learned from that. So I'm really excited. Thank you for asking.
Awesome. Fabulous. Again, Kylie, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for all the work you have done, not just in one, but two ACE terms and all the work you've done prior to that and what you are going to do in the
Yeah.
future. I am so excited and cannot wait. And thank you very much for everybody for joining us for another session of ACE Learns.